For 6 days in May 1980, the world watched a quiet street in London become a war zone. A diplomatic mission transformed into a fortress. A political protest escalated into a hostage crisis. Broadcast live into living rooms. And in the shadows, an elite, secretive unit prepared for a violent solution the British government hoped it would never have to authorize. This is not just a story of a siege. It is the story of the moment modern counterterrorism was born in public view, a brutal, precise ballet of media, politics, and lethal force. The Iranian Embassy siege was a perfect storm, and the men of the Special Air Service were the lightning. The Iranian Embassy at 16 Prince's Gate stood as an island of one nation's turmoil within another's calm. London in the spring of 1980 was a city still finding its post-war identity, while Iran was in the convulsive grip of its new Islamic revolution. The embassy was a flashpoint, a target for exiled dissidents, and a symbol of the Ayatollah Khomeini's contentious new regime. Its ordinary, white stuccoed facade, nestled among other grand embassies in South Kensington, belied the tension within. Inside, on the morning of April 30th, were 26 people, staffers, diplomats, visitors, and a solitary Metropolitan Police officer, Constable Trevor Locke, stationed as a routine precaution. Locke was unarmed. The ambassador, Dr. Afshar, was absent. The most senior figure was the chargé d'affaires, Dr. Nouri. The mood was one of bureaucratic unease, not fear. The blinds were up, letting in the spring light. No one saw the 6 men approaching the front steps. Just before 11:30 a.m., they called themselves the Democratic Revolutionary Front for the Liberation of Arabistan. They were Iranian Arabs from the oil-rich province of Khuzestan, seeking autonomy from Tehran. Their leader was Owen Ali Mohammed, known as Salim. They were young, politically fervent, and armed with submachine guns, pistols, and grenades. Their plan was to take the embassy and broadcast their demands for the release of 91 Arab prisoners in Iran. To them, this was a desperate act of revolutionary theater. They did not know they had just walked onto a stage that would be watched by millions, and where the final act would be written by Britain's most ruthless soldiers. The takeover was swift and violent. Bursting through the front door, they overpowered PC Locke, though he managed to secretly trigger his personal radio alarm. Gunfire erupted staccato bursts that shattered the calm of Prince's Gate. They rounded up hostages, herding them into rooms on the second floor. The sound of breaking glass and shouted orders in Farsi and Arabic spilled onto the street. The first terrified phone call was made to the BBC. "We have taken the embassy. We have hostages. Our demands must be met." The siege had begun. Within minutes, the Metropolitan Police's Diamond control system activated. The area was cordoned off. The world's media began to descend. Their lenses and microphones pointed at the now closed blinds of the embassy. Scotland Yard's C-13 technical branch scrambled to plant listening devices in the walls and chimney flues. Every sound from inside, every argument, every sob, every demand was now being monitored from a covert forward control base in a neighboring building. The police strategy, led by Chief Superintendent John Dello, was one of containment and negotiation. Time, Dello believed, is a great healer. They would talk, they would wait, they would wear the gunmen down. But in a barracks in Hereford, a different clock started ticking. As the police established their perimeter, a cryptic signal was received by the Special Air Service. "The London Bridge is down." It was the call-out. The men of B Squadron, 22 SAS, began to prepare. They studied blueprints of the embassy's layout, built a full-scale replica, and began to drill. Their ethos was the opposite of the police: speed, surprise, and overwhelming violence of action. They were the government's final option, a surgical instrument kept in a dark drawer. For now, they watched, and they waited in the shadows, knowing that if the politicians' patience broke, they would have approximately 17 minutes to end the siege one way or another. The sound of the first gunshot inside 16 Prince's Gate was not just a noise. It was a fracture line, splitting the world in two. On one side, the contained chaos of the hostage-takers. On the other, a rapidly assembling machine of state response. And in the middle, 26 lives, now reduced to bargaining chips in a geopolitical game none of them chose to play. PC Trevor Locke, his heart hammering against his ribs, found himself on the floor of the embassy's entrance hall, a gun pressed to his temple. The metallic smell of oil and cordite filled the air. Around him, the gunmen, their faces a mix of fury and nervous exhilaration, shouted orders in broken English and Farsi. Down, stay down. Locke's training kicked in. He made himself small, compliant, but his eyes were cataloging everything. 6 gunmen, 3 with Sterling submachine guns, 2 with pistols, one who seemed to be the leader, Salim, holding a grenade. Locke counted the hostages as they were shoved past men, women. A BBC sound engineer named Chris Kramer, who was there for a visa. Salim, his voice taut with the effort of control, demanded to speak to the ambassador. Told he was not there, his anger flared. The first bullet was fired into the ceiling, a deafening crack of plaster and warning. The message was clear. This was not a game. The gunmen began separating the hostages. Iranians were taken to one room on the second floor. Non-Iranians, the British and Arabs, were shoved into the telex room next door. The ideological lines were drawn from the first chaotic hour. Outside, the machinery of the state ground into its highest gear. The diamond command structure, designed for major incidents, activated. Commissioner Sir David McNee placed Chief Superintendent John Dello in tactical command of the immediate scene. Dello, a veteran of countless crises, established 3 perimeters: an inner sterile area for the gunmen, a middle area for police and utilities, and an outer cordon for press and public. His first priority: establish communication. A field telephone was rigged to run into the embassy. The first connection was made. Salim's voice came through the line, demanding an audience with the Arab ambassadors in London, and the immediate release of 91 prisoners from Iranian jails. He gave a deadline: noon the following day. If not, the hostages would be killed. Dello's voice was calm, a practiced monotone designed to lower temperatures. He played for time. We have received your demands. We are contacting the relevant parties. This takes time. The negotiator's art began the slow, deliberate stretching of minutes into hours, of hours into days, to drain the adrenaline from the crisis. Meanwhile, in a cramped room at the back of 14 Prince's Gate, the listeners from C-13 worked feverishly. Using drills disguised as roadworks, they bored tiny holes through the party wall and inserted fiber-optic microphones. They tapped phone lines. Soon, the sounds of the embassy were piped into headphones. Coughing, crying, the murmur of prayers, the tense arguments between the gunmen. The listeners became the ears of the state, constructing a sound picture of the diminishing hope inside. They noted a crucial, early fracture. One of the gunmen, known as Faisal, seemed younger, more frightened, arguing with Salim about the use of violence. The negotiators filed this away. A weak link could be exploited. Back in the telex room, the hostages grappled with their new reality. Chris Kramer, suffering from a pre-existing stomach condition, began to visibly deteriorate. Sympathetic to his pain, and perhaps seeing a propaganda opportunity, the gunman allowed a doctor to be summoned. Dr. John Lai, a police surgeon, was sent in the first outsider to breach the perimeter. He treated Kramer and reported back. The hostages were terrified but alive. The gunmen were jumpy, but for now disciplined. It was a small opening, a chink in the fortress wall. The police strategy of patient containment had its first tentative validation, but in Hereford, the SAS, watching the news reports, saw only a hardening target. Every hour that passed, they knew, gave the gunmen more time to rig the building with explosives, more time to prepare to die. In the dark listening post at 14 Prince's Gate, the war was fought with headphones and transcript pads. Every sigh, every whisper from inside the embassy was a piece of intelligence. But the most crucial sound they heard wasn't a demand or a threat. It was the sound of a man's spirit breaking, a sound that would change the calculus of the siege forever. The technical operation run by Detective Constable Harry and his C-13 team was a masterpiece of covert surveillance. By the end of day 2, they had created an auditory map of the embassy. They could identify individual hostages by their coughs. They tracked the gunmen's patrol routes by their footsteps. The listening devices, hidden in the chimney breast and behind skirting boards, revealed a deteriorating atmosphere. Food, initially plentiful from the embassy kitchen, was running low. The stench of unflushed toilets began to permeate the microphones. The psychological portrait of the gunman sharpened. Salim was intelligent, politically articulate, but prone to volatile mood swings. He held long, lecturing conversations with the more compliant hostages about the plight of Arabistan. The others, shy, Maki, and the others were harder, more openly hostile. And then there was Faisal. The listeners heard him question his leader. "This is wrong, Salim. We did not come to kill women." Salim would silence him with a sharp rebuke. The negotiators, led by Detective Constable Max Vernon, began crafting appeals designed to widen this rift, to offer Faisal a face-saving way out. But the breakthrough in intelligence came from an unexpected source: the hostages themselves. Forced to communicate with the police through shouted conversations from the windows, they began to relay coded information. Sim Harris, the BBC man, would ask for specific items: a change of clothes, a particular book, phrases that corresponded to prearranged signals about the number and disposition of the gunman. The listeners cross-referenced this with their audio, building a near-complete picture. They confirmed the hostages were Jijungze on the second floor, rear rooms. They confirmed the gunman had begun moving furniture to barricade the main staircase. Then, on the evening of day 3, the listeners heard a sound that chilled them: the slow, methodical tap-tap-tapping of a hammer on masonry. It was consistent, deliberate. The sound engineers analyzed the acoustics. It wasn't repair work. It was the sound of someone embedding something into the wall. The fear was immediate: explosives. Were they mining the building? The intelligence was rushed to Dello and, in a scrambled phone call, to the SAS headquarters in Hereford. The patient containment strategy now had a deadly timer attached to it. The possibility of a negotiated settlement began to evaporate with every tap of that hammer. This intelligence directly altered the SAS assault plan. The original idea of a frontal ground-floor entry was scrapped. If the stairs were booby-trapped, it would be a slaughter. The focus shifted to the roof and the rear of the building. Abseiling from the roof down to the second-floor balcony became the primary option. But there was a problem. The elegant Georgian-era balconies were decorative. Would they hold the weight of armored men? SAS troopers were dispatched under cover of darkness to secretly test the strength of identical balconies on neighboring buildings. The sound of that hammer had just rewritten their entire playbook. Back in the embassy, the civilian cost mounted in silence. The listeners heard hostages being forced to record propaganda statements. They heard the quiet sobbing of the female staff members. They heard Abbas Lavasani, the press officer, passionately arguing with Salim about journalistic integrity, making himself a target. And they heard Chris Kramer's health continue to decline, his moans a constant underscore to the tension. The sterile headphones in 14 Prince's Gate transmitted a very human despair, a despair that was slowly boxing the politicians into a corner where only a violent option remained. The gunmen had taken a building, but the world's television networks gave them a global stage. For the first time in history, a siege was broadcast in real time, turning a tense police operation into a public spectacle. The front line wasn't just at the police barricade. It was in the lens of every camera pointed at those closed second-floor blinds. By day 2, Prince's Gate had become a media encampment. Satellite trucks lined the side streets. Reporters from every major network established live positions, their commentary creating a parallel narrative to the secret negotiations. The gunmen understood this power instinctively. Salim demanded airtime. In a calculated move, the police and BBC agreed. A sound feed was run from the embassy to a BBC outside broadcast unit. Sim Harris, the hostage, was put on the line with the BBC's World at One program. Harris's voice, strained but clear, echoed into millions of homes. He relayed the terrorist demands, adding a desperate plea: "For God's sake, somebody do something." It was a propaganda coup for Salim, and a nightmare for the authorities. The siege was no longer a contained incident. It was a national drama with the public as jury. The government, wary of inflaming the situation or giving the gunman a platform, walked a tightrope. They allowed limited broadcasts but censored anything that could reveal police positions or tactics. The media presence created immense pressure on Chief Superintendent Dello. Every move his officers made was filmed. The forward control base had to be hidden in plain sight. The constant hum of generators and the glare of TV lights made covert movement nearly impossible. Yet, the media also became an unwitting tool. The SAS used the constant coverage to their advantage. Disguised as journalists or utility workers, troopers conducted close target reconnaissance, photographing window frames and roof layouts from just yards away, their cameras indistinguishable from those of the press. The most dramatic media moment came on day 5. Pushed by Salim, and with the police's reluctant coordination, ITN reporter Peter Snow was allowed to approach the embassy steps for a brief, direct interview through a first-floor window. Salim, his face obscured by a checkered keffiyeh, appeared at the window, a hostage visibly trembling beside him. He spoke calmly, reiterating his demands, warning that the hostages will pay the price if they were not met. The image was chilling a terrorist dictating terms on primetime television. It was the moment the abstract siege became a human face of menace for the British public. This broadcast had 2 immediate effects. Public opinion, which had been nervously supportive of negotiation, began to harden. The sight of a gunman on British soil making demands was an affront. Simultaneously, in Whitehall, the political calculus shifted. The hammering intelligence from the listeners, combined with this brazen TV appearance, made the status quo untenable. Home Secretary William Whitelaw and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher were now receiving hourly briefings that fused operational reports with media analysis. The window for a peaceful resolution was slamming shut. For the hostages, the media was a paradox. Hearing their situation discussed on the tiny radio in the telex room was a lifeline to the outside world, a proof they were not forgotten. But it was also torture. They heard speculative reports about their potential fate, heard pundits debate the likelihood of a storm. It made the walls feel both thinner and more suffocating. The civilian cost of this new era of televised terror was this psychological double bind, connected to the world, yet utterly trapped. As night fell on day 5, the media circus took on a grim carnival atmosphere. The world was waiting for the next act. In the BBC control truck, producers debated the ethics of broadcasting what might come next. In the SAS holding area, the troopers watched the news footage, studying Salim's mannerisms, the layout of the room behind him. The media had given them their final piece of target intelligence. The telex room from which Peter Snow had conducted his interview was now precisely identified. It was marked on the assault plan. The stage was set. The audience was watching. All that was missing was the signal to begin. Detective Constable Max Vernon's voice was the only thread connecting 2 worlds. Through the field telephone, he built a fragile bridge of words with Salim, a bridge designed not to reach an agreement, but to buy time and glean weakness. Every conversation was a high-wire act between empathy and deception, where a single misplaced word could mean a death sentence. Max Vernon was chosen for his calm, unflappable tone, a voice devoid of judgment or panic. His mission was not to resolve the political demands, which were impossible for Britain to meet, but to manage the emotional temperature inside the embassy. He became a lifeline for Salim, as much as for the hostages. He listened for hours to Salim's political grievances, validating his cause while subtly distancing it from his actions. "I understand your people are suffering, Salim, but these people in there with you, they are not the ones who caused that suffering." The negotiations followed a painful rhythm. Salim would issue an ultimatum. "The Arab ambassadors must come by 2 p.m., or we will kill a hostage." Vernon would acknowledge, then introduce a procedural delay. "We have contacted the Egyptian ambassador. He is consulting with his government. This is a matter of great protocol. We need more time." The deadline would pass. Sometimes Salim would erupt. Sometimes he would fall silent. The listeners would hear him arguing with his own men, the strain of waiting fragmenting the group. Vernon's masterstroke was exploiting the rift around Faisal. He began asking after the younger man's well-being. "Is Faisal all right?" He sounded distressed earlier. This subtle acknowledgement isolated Faisal in the eyes of the other gunmen, painting him as the negotiator's favorite, the potential traitor. It also offered Faisal a subconscious promise. "You are seen as different. There is a way out for you." The psychological pressure on the weakest link was deliberately, carefully increased. Simultaneously, Vernon orchestrated a series of confidence-building measures. He arranged for food to be sent in hot meals from a local restaurant. Each delivery was an opportunity. The police would insist the food be collected by unarmed embassy staff from the front step, forcing the gunmen to reveal themselves, to move, to break their routine. With each delivery, police sniper positions updated their sight pictures. The food also served a darker purpose: to establish a pattern of normalcy, to lull the gunmen into a false sense of control. The SAS needed them predictable. The key negotiation, however, centered on the bodies. Early in the siege, the gunmen had thrown the body of the embassy's lavatory attendant, killed in the initial storming, out the front door. Vernon used this to establish a crucial precedent. He negotiated, with immense difficulty, for the body to be removed by police. He framed it in terms of Islamic burial rites and basic humanity. Salim agreed. This established a rule: dead bodies could leave. It was a grim piece of protocol that would later become critically important. By day 5, the facade of negotiation was crumbling. Salim's demands grew more erratic. He asked for a plane to fly him and his men out of the country. Vernon, under strict orders, could only offer vague assurances that the request was being considered at the highest levels. Both men knew it was a lie. The conversation became a strange, grim pantomime. Vernon was no longer trying to solve the crisis. He was providing an audio log for the politicians to prove every peaceful avenue had been exhausted. The field telephone line he had nurtured for days was now just a wire waiting to be cut by the coming storm. The civilian cost of this psychological game was borne by the hostages. They heard both sides of the conversations. They heard Vernon's calm promises and felt the rising tide of Salim's frustration when those promises evaporated. They were human barometers for the failing pressure. Abbas Lavasani, emboldened by the negotiator's voice, began to argue more fiercely with Salim, a fatal courage. For the others, the negotiations were a torturous roller coaster, each hint of progress lifting them, each subsequent collapse plunging them deeper into despair. They were pawns in a game where the only winning move was being made by men in black, preparing to abseil from the roof. In Whitehall, far from the barking dogs and TV lights of Prince's Gate, the siege was a chess game played on a global board. Every whispered update from the listening post, every frame of television footage, was weighed against diplomatic repercussions and raw political survival. The fate of the hostages now rested in the hands of a small, tense group around the Prime Minister. The Cobra Committee, the government's emergency crisis response team, met in a secure, windowless briefing room beneath Whitehall. Chaired by Home Secretary William Whitelaw, it included the Defense Secretary, the Foreign Secretary, the heads of MI5 and MI6, and the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. Their reports were funneled through a direct line to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher at number 10. The intelligence was stark. The gunmen were likely embedding explosives. Their morale was fracturing, making them more unpredictable, and the media spectacle was eroding public confidence. The diplomatic front was a minefield. The Foreign Office was engaged in frantic, secret, back-channel communications with Tehran. The Iranian government, embarrassed by the siege and furious that their embassy was occupied, sent mixed signals. Initially, they demanded the UK respect diplomatic sovereignty and not storm the building. Later, as the Revolutionary Guard's influence prevailed, their tone shifted towards a harder line, almost daring the British to take action. Meanwhile, Arab ambassadors in London, caught between solidarity with the gunmen's cause and their host country's laws, provided a stalled, useless channel. The political demand for their involvement, so central to Salim's plan, became a diplomatic dead end. Thatcher's position was clear from the start. The UK would not negotiate with terrorists. But the principle collided with the grim reality of potential slaughter. Whitelaw and the police advocated for patience, believing time would cause the gunmen to surrender. The military, represented by the Chief of the General Staff and the SAS commander, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rose, argued that delay only increased the risk. Rose presented the assault plan, a simultaneous entry from the roof and rear, using frame charges and stun grenades. He gave the politicians a brutal statistic: even in a best-case scenario, they should expect 40% hostage casualties. The room fell silent. The pressure escalated with each passing deadline. When Salim threatened to kill a hostage at noon on day 4, Cobra was in permanent session. The order to the SAS was put on standby. Snipers had clear shots on several gunmen through the windows. The authority to use deadly force to prevent a killing was given. But as the deadline passed with no shot, the tension didn't break, it compounded. The politicians were now dealing with the psychological warfare of the gunmen, and it was taking its toll. The hourly intelligence summaries from the listening post at 14 Prince's Gate became the most dreaded documents in Whitehall. Thatcher's decisive moment came after the televised interview with Salim. The image of a terrorist dictating terms on British soil was, to her, an intolerable humiliation. It transformed the siege from a policing matter to a national security crisis. She instructed Whitelaw. The police were to have one more day to secure a surrender. After that, the military option would be authorized. The signal was sent to Hereford. Prepare to deploy. The SAS loading of their helicopters, with assault gear, was photographed by a keen-eyed press photographer. A security breach that sent panic through Cobra, but also sent an unmistakable signal to Salim. The civilian cost in this high-stakes game was an abstraction to the politicians, a number on a page. But one man forced it into the room. The chargé d'affaires, Dr. Nouri, who managed to make a frantic phone call to the Foreign Office. "You must not storm, they will kill us all." His terror was a raw human counterpoint to the clinical briefings. It was noted, filed, and weighed against the greater political imperative of demonstrating state strength. The decision was crystallizing. The risk of storming was catastrophic, but the risk of not storming of a massacre after a humiliating capitulation was, to Thatcher's government, existential. On day 6, the tension snapped. A single muffled gunshot echoed through the listening devices. Then, a body was shoved out the front door. The siege had entered its terminal phase. The SAS, already in position, received the code word. They moved. But in the chaotic seconds that followed, the perfect plan met the messy reality of a dying man's last act. The morning of May 5th dawned with a brittle silence. Overnight, the listeners had reported heightened activity, shouting, furniture being dragged. At 1:30 p.m., the listener's transcript noted a sharp, isolated sound. Possible weapon discharge. Single round. Location: second floor. Rear room. Minutes later, a horrifying sight. The front door opened, and the body of a hostage was unceremoniously pushed down the steps. It was Abbas Lavasani, the press officer who had argued with Salim. He had been shot in the head. The negotiator's rule had been invoked: a body could leave. In the forward control base, chaos erupted. Dello grabbed the field telephone. Salim's voice was icy final. "You did not meet our demands. This is the result. The next will die in 30 minutes. The negotiator's bridge had been burned. Dello immediately contacted Cobra. The decision, already pre-made, was confirmed in seconds. The code word London Bridge was transmitted to the SAS holding area. The assault was on. The SAS teams were already in place. The mountain troop was on the roof, ropes secured. The pagoda troop was at the rear, in the garden of the Ethiopian Embassy, ready to assault the ground floor windows and staircase. At 1:50 p.m., the final go was given. The plan was for synchronized explosions, a frame charge on the rear skylight for the roof team, and a larger charge on the French windows at the back for the ground team. But as the roof team prepared their abseil, a disaster unfolded. One of the troopers, in his heavy assault gear, lost his footing on the slippery, lead-lined roof. He crashed through a skylight, falling into the building prematurely, with a tremendous crash of glass and debris. The sound was unmistakable. Inside, the gunmen were alerted. Shouting erupted. The assault was compromised before it had begun. In the control room, Dello and the SAS commander heard the crash over the open comms. There was a frozen second of utter dread. The element of surprise was gone. The ground commander made a split-second decision. He screamed, "Go, go, go," into his radio. The synchronized detonation was abandoned. The rear assault team blew their charge early, the blast shattering the elegant French windows in a fireball of splintered wood and glass. Stun grenades were hurled in. The building was now being assaulted from 2 points, but not in the planned clinical sequence. It was a violent, chaotic entry. Inside, all hell broke loose. Hostages dove to the floor. Gunmen scrambled for their weapons. Salim, in the telex room, grabbed a grenade and ran into the hallway. where he was immediately confronted by the first SAS man from the roof, who had landed in the wrong room. In the confined space, the trooper couldn't risk a shot that might hit a hostage. He tackled Salim. They grappled for the grenade. It was PC Trevor Locke, the policeman held hostage for 6 days, who lunged from the floor and helped wrestle Salim down, seizing his pistol. The sound of automatic fire now filled the building. The SAS method was brutal. The room clear. Any room with a closed door received a stun grenade, then immediate entry, with shots fired at any armed or threatening target. Identification was near impossible in the smoke and panic. The troopers shouted, "Get down! Get down!" Hostages froze or threw themselves flat. The gunmen, caught in the open, were engaged and killed with swift, controlled bursts. The loud crash of the falling trooper through the skylight had turned a surgical strike into a close-quarters melee, where speed and aggression were the only substitutes for surprise. For the hostages on the floor, the world dissolved into a deafening, blinding chaos of explosions, shouts, and gunfire. For the SAS men storming in, it was a claustrophobic nightmare of smoke, flashbangs, and split-second decisions. The promised 17-minute operation became an eternity, where every shadow could be a friend or a foe, and the line between rescue and execution vanished. The interior of the embassy became a layered hell. The ground floor, assaulted by the Pagoda troop, was a storm of splinters from the blown-in French windows. Troopers fanned out, clearing the ground floor rooms with shouts and stun grenades. Finding them empty, they immediately began stacking at the bottom of the main staircase. Above them, on the second floor, was the heart of the crisis: the hostages, the gunmen, and the falling mountain troop. On the second-floor landing, the situation was pure pandemonium. The first SAS man down the rope from the roof was in a fierce hand-to-hand struggle with Salim. 2 other troopers abseiled down past the now gaping skylight, kicking through the windows of the rear rooms. They entered the room where most of the male hostages were held. The scene they encountered was one of primal terror. Men curled in fetal positions on the floor, hands over their heads. The troopers had to instantly differentiate. "Where are they?" one bellowed. A hostage, too terrified to speak, could only point a shaking finger towards the door. In the hallway, the firefight began. A gunman, later identified as Shai, emerged from a side room firing a Sterling submachine gun on full auto. The rounds chewed into the wall above the hostages' heads. An SAS trooper, positioned in a doorway, returned fire with his MP5. A short, precise burst struck Shai in the chest and head, killing him instantly. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. Hostages screamed. The SAS method was relentless. They moved in pairs, leapfrogging down the hallway. One would provide covering fire while the other advanced, kicked in a door, and cleared a room. In one room, they found the female hostages. A trooper stood in the doorway, his weapon scanning. "Stay down! Do not move!" The women obeyed, frozen. In another room, they found a gunman trying to hide among hostages. He was dragged out and shot. The rules of engagement were clear. Any armed individual, any perceived threat, was to be neutralized. Meanwhile, a critical drama unfolded in the telex room. Several gunmen had barricaded themselves in with hostages. An SAS team stacked outside the door. They could hear shouts inside in Farsi. A stun grenade was prepared, but before they could blow the door, it opened a crack. A hostage, his face white with fear, was shoved forward as a human shield. Behind him, a gunman held a grenade, the pin visibly out. It was a standoff. The trooper aimed, but the shot was impossible. A fraction of a second's hesitation, then the gunman made a fatal error. He shifted his grip, trying to throw the grenade into the hallway. In that moment, the SAS soldier fired. The gunman fell back, the grenade dropping at his feet. The trooper slammed the door shut. The muffled thump of the explosion inside the room was followed by silence. As the gunfire began to subside into isolated shots, a new sound emerged: the crackle of fire. A stun grenade or a tracer round had ignited curtains or furniture. Smoke began to billow through the second floor. The shout went up, "Fire! Get them out!" The rescue now became an evacuation. Troopers began physically hauling dazed, choking hostages to their feet, pushing them towards the stairs or the blown-out windows, where they were passed down ladders to the garden. 17 minutes after the first explosion, the last hostage was pulled from a smoke-filled room. The shooting had stopped. The building crackled with flames. The deafening, disorienting echo of stun grenades and automatic fire was replaced by the shouts of firefighters and the cries of the rescued. The SAS began their withdrawal, leaving the smoldering, bloody evidence of their work for the police to secure. For the hostages, the nightmare of confinement had ended, only to be replaced by the new, surreal nightmare of sudden, violent freedom. In the final, smoke-choked moments of the assault, one room remained sealed. Inside, a lone gunman and a cluster of hostages awaited a fate decided by a single pulled pin. The decision made by the SAS trooper at that door wasn't in the manual. It was a brutal calculus of sacrifice, a moment where the clean lines of the rescue plan dissolved into a moral abyss. Room 9, the embassy's coding and cipher room, was at the end of the second-floor corridor. When the assault began, gunman Maki and 3 terrified male hostages had retreated there, barricading the heavy door with a filing cabinet. As the sound of fighting drew closer, Maki's desperation peaked. He produced a Soviet F-1 fragmentation grenade, pulled the pin, and held the sprung lever down. He waved it at the hostages, his message clear. If the door opened, he would release it, killing everyone in the small room. Outside, a 2-man SAS team, red and blue, reached the door. They could hear Maki shouting in Arabic. Through the keyhole, they saw the grenade in his hand, the pin missing. They froze. Standard procedure for a barricaded suspect with a grenade was to contain and negotiate. But there was no time. The building was on fire. Smoke was pouring under the door. The hostages inside were coughing, screaming. Red keyed his radio. 0, this is Red 1. Room 9 is barred. 1 Tango confirmed. He has a grenade. Pin out. Multiple hostages. The response from the command net was static, then a torn, urgent voice. You are clear to engage. Fire is spreading. Get them out. The authorization was given, but the tactical problem remained absolute. Opening the door would trigger the grenade. Blue made a horrifying suggestion. We blow the door. The blast might knock him down, maybe he drops it. Red shook his head. The door was solid oak. The frame charge needed would be huge, likely fatal to anyone close inside, and it wouldn't guarantee the grenade wouldn't go off. They were out of time. The smoke was thickening. A hostage inside began pounding on the door, screaming, "Please, we're burning!" Red made a decision that would haunt him. He spoke quietly to Blue. When I open it, you put 2 in his head. Instant motor function loss. He might not release. It was a monstrous gamble. If Maki's fingers even twitched in the nanosecond after death, the lever would fly off, and the grenade would detonate in 4 seconds. They were betting a hostage's life on the precision of a brainstem shot and the quirks of human neurology. Red took a deep breath, counted down silently, and kicked the door just beside the lock. The barricade shifted. The door flew inward. The scene was frozen for a split second. Maki, wild-eyed, the grenade held high. 3 hostages on the floor behind him. Blue, from a crouch in the hallway, fired. 2 rounds. The impact punched Maki back against the wall. His arm holding the grenade dropped to his side, but his hand remained closed. The lever was still depressed. The grenade was live, but secure in his dead grasp. Red rushed in, shouting at the hostages to get out. As they scrambled past, he approached Maki's body. The grenade was still clutched in his hand. Gently, carefully, Red pried the dead fingers open, took the grenade, and reinserted the pin he found on the floor nearby. He handed it to Blue like a cursed relic. The Soviet F-1 grenade, its pin temporarily replaced, was later logged as evidence. The room was cleared. The gamble had, against all odds, worked. But the civilian cost of that moment was immeasurable. The 3 hostages who emerged witnessed a man's brains blown out inches from them, then saw a soldier calmly retrieve a live bomb from the corpse. Their rescue was also a profound trauma. For Red and Blue, the operation was a success. They had saved lives. But in the debrief, they would dissect that moment endlessly. Had they just been lucky? Was it the right call? The clean victory of the overall assault was forever stained, for them, by the spectral image of that grenade in a dead man's hand, a symbol of how close they had come to becoming murderers instead of rescuers. PC Trevor Locke spent 6 days as a prisoner, a prop, and a target. When the SAS burst in, his role transformed in an instant. From hostage to participant, he seized not just a weapon, but agency. His struggle with Salim in the hallway became the siege's most intimate duel, a policeman's oath confronting a terrorist's desperation at point-blank range. For 138 hours, Trevor Locke played a delicate, terrifying game. He was a police officer, surrounded by armed men who knew he was a police officer. He made himself useful fetching food, translating haltingly, trying to calm other hostages. He built a fragile rapport with Salim, appealing to his sense of honorable conduct. But his mind was a constant, silent reconnaissance. He memorized the gunmen's routines, their weapons' condition, the layout of barricades. He passed coded information in his shouted conversations from the window, using prearranged phrases about needing laundry or a specific book to signal numbers and positions. When the assault began, Locke was in the telex room with Salim and several other hostages. The crashing skylight and subsequent explosions triggered instant chaos. Salim, screaming, pulled a grenade from his belt and ran into the hallway, presumably to confront the invaders. Locke saw his chance. As the other hostages dove to the floor, Locke did not. He followed Salim out. In the smoke-filled hallway, he saw Salim grappling with the first SAS trooper, who had landed awkwardly from his abseil. The grenade was between them, a deadly prize. Locke didn't hesitate. He launched himself at Salim, grabbing the arm that held the grenade and forcing it upward against the wall. It was a vicious, silent fight, 3 men tangled, each knowing the release of that lever meant death. Locke's police training and restraint and control came to the fore. He didn't try to punch. He used leverage and weight. He hooked a leg around Salim's, trying to trip him. The SAS trooper, recovering, used the butt of his MP5 to strike Salim's head. Dazed, Salim's grip on the grenade loosened. Locke seized the moment. He wrenched the grenade from Salim's hand. In the same motion, he pulled the pin from his own belt. It was still attached by a ring to his clothing, and, with a frantic practiced move, reinserted it into the grenade, resecuring the lever. With the immediate explosive threat neutralized, the focus turned to Salim's pistol. He had a Browning high-power in a shoulder holster. As the SAS trooper pinned Salim, Locke reached and yanked the pistol free. He didn't fire. He simply secured it, removing the magazine and clearing the chamber, his movements automatic from 1,000 range drills. The Browning high-power pistol, now safe and inert, became a symbol of Locke's extraordinary transition from victim to active resolver. The rest of the assault passed around them like a violent dream. Troopers ran past, kicking in doors. Gunfire echoed. Locke, now armed with a dead man's gun, helped usher disoriented hostages towards the stairs, identifying himself as police. To the SAS, he was an unknown in civilian clothes, holding a weapon. For a heart-stopping moment, a trooper covered him, shouting, "Drop it!" Locke immediately threw the pistol down and put his hands up, shouting, "Police, hostage!" He was recognized, pulled to safety, and the moment passed. Locke's actions were immediately hailed as heroic. He had disarmed the leader and secured a live grenade. But for Locke, the memory was not one of heroism, but of visceral, intimate violence. The feel of Salim's sweat-soaked shirt, the smell of his breath, the brute strength of his struggle, these were not the abstractions of a police operation. They were the sensations of a fight for survival. The civilian cost for Locke was the obliteration of the line between his professional duty and his personal trauma. He had done his job perfectly, and it would leave scars no metal could cover. His testimony would later be crucial, but the man who gave it was forever altered by those minutes in the hallway, where he ceased to be a symbol and became, once again, a policeman. As the gunfire died, a new enemy took hold. Fire. Flames, ignited by explosives or munitions, began to consume the embassy's upper floors. The rescue now became a desperate evacuation, a race against an indiscriminate killer. The iconic images of the siege hostages clambering down ladders from billowing smoke were born not just from liberation, but from a fight for survival against the aftermath. The fire started in multiple places, almost simultaneously. A stun grenade had landed in a pile of curtains. Tracer rounds from a Sterling submachine gun had smoldered in carpets. The building, with its old dry wood and layers of paint, was a tinderbox. Within minutes of the assault's start, thick, acrid smoke began to pour from the shattered windows of the second floor. a black flag against the London sky. For the SAS, the mission objective changed instantly. Clear and hold became evacuate and survive. Troopers switched from hunting gunmen to shepherding hostages. The primary escape route, the main staircase, was becoming a chimney of superheated smoke. Alternative exits were needed. Troopers began kicking out the remaining panes of the large rear windows, exposing the ornate balconies. They shouted for ladders from the fire brigade, which had been standing by. The scene on the balconies was one of controlled panic. Hostages, choking and blinded by smoke, were half carried, half pushed by black-clad figures towards the railings. Go! Down the ladder! Now! SAS troopers, their respirators making them look inhuman, physically manhandled people onto the rungs. Some hostages froze, terrified of the height. One trooper was seen simply picking up a petite female secretary and placing her on the ladder, guiding her hands to the rails before turning back for the next. Below, in the embassy garden, a surreal reception committee had formed. Firefighters steadied ladders, police officers caught jumping hostages, ambulance crews triaged the wounded, and the world's media, from behind their cordon, captured every second. The most famous image of Sim Harris, the BBC man, clambering down a ladder, his face a mask of soot and relief, was broadcast live. It was the moment the siege visually ended for the public, a clean rescue from a burning building. But inside, the race was still on. Troopers conducted final sweeps, shouting into smoke-filled rooms. "Anion left, call out!" They found one hostage, unconscious from smoke inhalation, under a desk. They dragged him out by his ankles. They found the body of Ali Akbar Samadzadeh, a hostage caught in the crossfire. They marked his location for recovery. The heat was becoming intense. Plaster cracked and fell from the ceiling. The sound of roaring flame grew louder. The last men out were the SAS themselves. As the fire took hold, they retreated from the upper floor, covering each other's withdrawal. They descended the now raging staircase, the heat searing through their Nomex suits. They exited through the blown-out French windows, into the garden, where they were met not by cheers, but by the organized chaos of the emergency services. They stripped off their heavy gear, their faces slick with sweat and grime, and began the silent accounting of men and equipment. The fire brigade moved in to tackle the blaze, but the building's interior was gutted. The thick black smoke pouring from the elegant Georgian windows became the siege's funeral pyre, consuming the physical evidence of the 6-day ordeal. It also consumed potential evidence documents, forensic traces, but that was a secondary concern. The primary objective, saving lives, had been achieved, albeit at a terrible price and in a crucible of flame. The civilian cost of the fire was both physical and psychological. Several hostages suffered smoke inhalation and burns. All carried the primal fear of being burned alive, added to the trauma of captivity and gunfire. For them, the final moments of their ordeal were a sensory hell of heat, choking darkness, and the disorienting guidance of masked rescuers. Their freedom was a stumble down a ladder into blinding TV lights, a transition from one overwhelming reality to another. The clean, heroic narrative of the rescue belied the messy, terrifying, and fiery reality of its execution. Amid the black balaclavas and the soot-stained faces of the hostages, one image stood out: the terrified, youthful face of the sole surviving gunman, Faisal, being led away in handcuffs. His survival was a fluke, a mistake, and a political complication. He was the living ghost of the siege, a witness who would force the state to confront its own narrative in a courtroom. In the chaotic evacuation, as hostages were rushed down ladders and through the garden, an SAS trooper noticed something odd. One of the hostages, a slight young man, was not behaving like the others. He wasn't crying, wasn't disoriented. He was scanning, calculating. As the trooper approached to guide him, the young man flinched and tried to melt back into the crowd. The trooper grabbed him. "You, come with me." A quick frisk revealed nothing. He had ditched his weapon, but his pockets were full of ammunition. It was Faisal, the young, dissenting gunman the listeners had identified days before. In the final moments, as the SAS stormed the room he was in, he had thrown down his gun, stripped off his jacket, and hidden among the hostages, pretending to be one of them. His gamble almost worked. But the trooper's instinct, honed by years of discerning threat from fear, picked him out. He was handcuffed with plastic ties and shoved into a waiting police van, his face a mask of sullen terror captured in a dozen press photographs. His survival created an immediate dilemma. The government's preferred story was clean: terrorist gang eliminated, hostages rescued. A living perpetrator was a loose end. He could claim mistreatment, become a cause célèbre, reveal operational details in court. There were undoubtedly voices in Whitehall that wished he had been found with a gun in his hand, but he hadn't. He was a prisoner of war on British soil, entitled to due process. Faisal was taken to Paddington Green Police Station, the high-security facility for terrorist suspects. He was interrogated for days by Special Branch. He was frightened, cooperative in a shallow way. He confirmed the group's composition, their motives, their internal tensions. He gave up the names of overseas contacts, likely already known to MI6. His testimony confirmed the intelligence picture, but added little that was new. He was a foot soldier, not a strategist. The decision was made to prosecute him. He was charged with murder, false imprisonment, and firearms offenses. The trial would be a public reckoning, a chance for the state to present its validated narrative. But it was also a risk. The defense would try to put the SAS on trial, to question the proportionality of the assault, to portray Faisal as a coerced young idealist. The press photograph of Faisal's pale, handcuffed face became a pre-trial exhibit, a symbol of the messy justice that follows a clean military victory. For the hostages, Faisal's survival was a complex wound. Some felt a twisted pity for him. He was the one who had seemed least committed to violence. Others felt betrayed and enraged that he might live while their colleagues were dead. They would have to face him in court, to relive their ordeal under cross-examination. The civilian cost of the siege now included the burden of testimony, of being used as pawns in a second, legal battle. Faisal's presence also forced a covert ethical reckoning within the SAS. The trooper who had captured him had followed the rules of engagement and the law. He had made a professional distinction in the heat of battle that politicians in Cobra had not had to make. In the debrief, the moment was noted, but not celebrated. It was a reminder that their world was not binary, that survivors on the other side created political and moral complications. Faisal was their problem now, a living testament to the fact that even a perfect assault leaves unanswered questions walking away in handcuffs. In a sterile room in Hereford, the assault was relived, not as a triumph, but as a series of critical incidents. The crashed skylight, the near-detonated grenade, the captured gunman, each was a flaw to be dissected. For the SAS, the victory was real, but the after-action report was a Bible of brutal honesty, written to ensure the next time would be cleaner, faster, deadlier. The SAS debrief began before the smoke had cleared in London. The troopers were flown back to Hereford, isolated and debriefed individually and in teams. The process was not about assigning blame, but about extracting every shred of actionable data. The guiding principle: the only failure is the failure to learn. The atmosphere was clinical, detached, and utterly focused. The first major incident, the roof infiltration, compromise. The trooper who fell was unhurt, but the incident was a major tactical failure. Why did he slip? Slick roofing lead from overnight rain. Were the abseil ropes properly secured? Yes. Was his equipment faulty? No. The conclusion: they had underestimated the environmental factor. The fix: new boot soles with a specific compound for wet lead, and mandatory roof recce drills under wet conditions for all assault troopers. The second, the room: clearing procedures with mixed hostages and gunmen. Several troopers reported the extreme difficulty of PID, positive identification, in the smoke and chaos. The standard shout of "get down" worked for Brits, but some Iranian hostages didn't understand English commands. One hostage was nearly shot because he stood up in panic. The conclusion: language was a vulnerability. The fix: basic threat commands in multiple languages, Farsi, Arabic, added to pre-assault briefings, and the use of more distinctive, non-verbal signals for comply in future operations. The third, and most serious, the grenade incident in Room 9. The decision-making process of Red and Blue was put under a microscope. Was their gamble justified? The fire was a legitimate exigent circumstance, but betting on a brainstem shot to prevent a grenade detonation was, in the cold light of day, considered an unacceptable risk. The conclusion: they needed a tactical option for that scenario. The fix: development of capture nets and specialized, less lethal entry munitions designed to disorient and physically restrain, without relying on instant kill shots. The debrief also covered successes: the switch from the front to the rear assault as the main effort, based on the hammering intelligence, was validated. The speed of the assault after the compromise was praised. The handling of the fire and evacuation, while improvised, was deemed effective. PC Locke's actions were analyzed from a tactical perspective. A civilian successfully securing a live grenade and a sidearm under fire was noted as an exceptional, if non-replicable, data point. But the civilian cost was a shadow over the technical analysis. The 2 hostage deaths were examined forensically. Abbas Lavasani was executed before the assault began, a political murder. Ali Akbar Samadzade's death was harder. Ballistics and positional reports were studied. It appeared he was hit by a ricochet or a stray round during the initial hallway firefight. Could it have been prevented? Possibly, with better containment of that engagement. It was logged as a regrettable but accepted operational casualty. The term was clinical. The reality was a man dead, caught between 2 forces. The detailed after-action map of the second floor, annotated with every shot fired and every movement, became a sacred text in Hereford. It was used to train the next generation. The siege of Prince's Gate was no longer a current event. It was a case study. The lessons learned would be applied in countless exercises and would influence hostage rescue tactics from the UK to Australia to the US Delta Force. The SAS had won publicly on television, but they won professionally in that quiet debrief room where their victory was taken apart and rebuilt, stronger and more ruthless, for the next invisible war. As the fire trucks sprayed their last jets of water on 16 Prince's Gate, a different kind of operation began in Westminster. The Thatcher government moved quickly to shape the story, transforming a violent, chaotic rescue into a narrative of unwavering resolve. The siege was over, but the battle for its meaning in the history books had just begun. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher addressed the House of Commons the following day. Her statement was a masterpiece of political framing. She praised the courage and patience of the police, the quite extraordinary courage and skill of the SAS, and the fortitude of the hostages. She emphasized that a firm line must be taken against terrorism, and that the UK would never negotiate under duress. The subtext was clear. Her government's strength had prevailed. The opposition, led by James Callaghan, offered full support, turning the moment into one of rare national unity. The media, which had been a complicating factor during the siege, now became a conduit for the victory narrative. Newspapers were filled with heroic images of abseiling troopers and headlines like "The Day the SAS Won." Carefully managed interviews with beaming hostages were arranged. The chaotic, frightening reality of the assault was edited into a streamlined sequence of professional heroism. The government's media managers ensured the story focused on the outcome, not the precarious moments of compromise and near disaster. Internationally, the dividends were immediate. Allies, particularly the United States under President Carter, offered strong public support. The message to state sponsors of terrorism was clear. The UK had a new threshold for response. Privately, foreign intelligence services requested detailed briefings on the SAS tactics. The operation became a global benchmark. For Thatcher, it was a crucial piece of political capital, reinforcing her Iron Lady persona just as she was embarking on deeply contentious domestic economic reforms. It demonstrated that she could wield hard power decisively. However, the political victory lap was not without its quiet tensions. The Home Office and the Metropolitan Police felt somewhat sidelined. Their 6 days of patient negotiation, which had contained the crisis and gathered vital intelligence, were overshadowed by the 17-minute spectacle of military action. There was a quiet, bureaucratic resentment that the hard power of the military had trumped the soft power of policing in the public imagination. The official government press release, which meticulously listed the sequence of events, subtly downplayed the police's central role in managing the crisis up to the final moment. The handling of the sole survivor Faisal was another delicate political issue. The government had to balance a desire for a swift, harsh justice with the need to demonstrate the fairness of British law. The decision to grant him a full trial was a calculated risk, an assertion of confidence in the state's institutions. It also served to distance the political executive from the operational outcome. Justice was a matter for the courts, not the cabinet. But the political narrative deliberately obscured the civilian cost. The trauma of the hostages was acknowledged but quickly set aside as a private matter. The deaths of Lavasani and Samadzadeh were framed as tragic necessities, murders ultimately attributable to the terrorists' actions. The government offered no formal compensation scheme for the hostages or the families of the deceased. Their suffering was absorbed into the greater national story of triumph. This omission would foster a quiet, lasting bitterness among some survivors, who felt used twice over, first as pawns in the siege, then as props in a political theater. By the week's end, the siege had been successfully packaged. It was no longer a complex event with moral ambiguities and human suffering. It was the Siege of London, a clean parable of good versus evil, resolve versus barbarism. This narrative was politically invaluable, but it created a template that would later constrain governments in future crises, raising public expectations for a decisive, military-style solution to every complex hostage scenario. The political victory was complete, but its legacy was a double-edged sword. The television cameras followed the hostages to the hospital gates, then turned away. Behind those doors, the real work of survival began. For the 24 people who walked out, the siege was not over. It had migrated inward, manifesting as nightmares, panic attacks, and a profound disconnection from the world that had celebrated their rescue. The physical injuries were treated first: smoke inhalation, minor burns, cuts from broken glass. But the psychiatric team at the hospital recognized the deeper wounds. These people had endured 6 days of terror, the constant threat of death, and a final, violent rescue that was itself traumatizing. They were diagnosed with what would later be termed post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, though in 1980 the condition was poorly understood, especially in civilians. The symptoms were varied and debilitating. Chris Kramer, the BBC man, suffered crippling flashbacks and anxiety attacks that would end his career in frontline journalism. Sim Harris found he couldn't bear enclosed spaces or sudden loud noises. Many suffered from survivor's guilt, particularly over the deaths of Lavasani and Samadzadeh. "Why them, and not me?" was a constant haunting refrain. Sleep was invaded by nightmares of grenades, fire, and the faces of the gunmen. The hostages received limited ad hoc counseling. There was no formal, state-funded long-term care program. They were expected to be grateful and to move on. Some tried to return to work at the embassy or the BBC, only to find themselves triggered by mundane things: the sound of a printer, like the telex machine, the sight of a certain pattern of window blinds, the smell of certain foods that had been sent in during the siege. The hospital discharge papers that marked their freedom were, for many, just the beginning of a much longer, invisible imprisonment. Relationships strained under the pressure. Spouses and children couldn't understand the mood swings, the irritability, the emotional withdrawal. "You're home. You're safe. Why aren't you happy?" The hostages often couldn't explain it themselves. They felt alienated from their own families, from a public that saw them as lucky survivors, and from each other. They shared a bond, but it was a bond of mutual pain, not one they could easily lean on. PC Trevor faced a unique burden. Heralded as a hero, he was promoted and awarded the George Cross. But the mantle of heroism felt like a cage. He disliked the attention, haunted by the memory of the fight with Salim. He felt his actions were simply his duty, not something extraordinary. The trauma of his prolonged captivity and sudden violent agency left him with a profound ambivalence about the event that defined his public life. He would later suffer a breakdown and take early retirement from the police, a casualty of his courage. The civilian cost, therefore, was a long, slow bleed. Careers were derailed. Marriages failed. Health deteriorated. For years, the survivors navigated anniversaries, news reports, and the inevitable "Where were you during the siege?" questions with a practiced, hollow smile. They participated in documentaries, their stories becoming public property, yet their private suffering remained largely unaddressed by the state that had saved them. Their rescue was a matter of national record. Their recovery was a private struggle. This private trauma stood in stark, silent contrast to the public triumph. It was the unacknowledged price of the SAS's speed and the government's resolve. While politicians gave speeches and the regiment refined its tactics, the hostages were left to piece together shattered minds with minimal support. Their experience became a quiet, powerful argument for the future development of dedicated trauma care for victims of terrorism. An argument made not in policy papers, but in the silent suffering of 24 people trying to relearn how to live. The Old Bailey 1981. The sole surviving gunman stood in the dock, a tiny figure in a vast courtroom. His trial was not just about his guilt, but a public autopsy of the entire siege. The SAS, the police, and the hostages were forced to relive every moment under the cold, precise scrutiny of the law. The trial of Faisal, his real name, Hassam Abdul Hadi, was a media event, though more subdued than the siege itself. The charges were grave: murder, false imprisonment, conspiracy. The Crown's case was straightforward. He was part of an armed group that had taken hostages, killed one, and precipitated a violent resolution. The evidence was overwhelming: hostage testimony, forensic links to weapons, his own admission of presence. The defense strategy, however, aimed to complicate the narrative. They did not deny his presence, but sought to mitigate his culpability. They portrayed him as a young, naive idealist, coerced by the older, more fanatical Salim. They cited the listener's transcripts, which showed him arguing against violence. They suggested he had effectively withdrawn from the conspiracy by discarding his weapon and hiding among the hostages before the assault, an attempt to surrender. This forced a detailed re-examination of the siege's final moments. SAS troopers were called to testify. Their accounts were crisp, professional, and devoid of emotion. They described the chaos, the difficulty of identification. Under cross-examination, defense counsel probed the rules of engagement. Would you have shot my client if he had been holding a weapon? Yes. And if he was not? We were trained to identify threats. The line of questioning aimed to paint the SAS as indiscriminate, to make Faisal's survival seem like a lucky escape from summary execution. The hostages who testified provided the most emotionally powerful evidence. They described their fear, the conditions, the moments of violence. When asked about Faisal, their responses were mixed. Some said he seemed gentler. Others said he was just as complicit through his presence. Their testimony underscored the impossibility of Faisal's position. To the hostages, all the gunmen were the enemy. To the court, individual intent mattered. The prosecution's masterstroke was focusing on the murder of Abbas Lavasani. While they could not prove Faisal pulled the trigger, evidence suggested it was Salim. They argued he was part of a joint enterprise. By participating in the armed siege, he shared responsibility for all foreseeable consequences, including murder. This legal doctrine was the hammer that would break the defense's mitigation argument. The official court transcript, with its dry legal language, captured none of the tension in the room as the verdict was delivered. After a relatively short deliberation, the jury found Faisal guilty of murder and all other charges. The judge, in sentencing him to life imprisonment with a recommendation he serve at least 25 years, stated, "You were part of a terrorist gang which held innocent people in terror for 6 days and which committed cold-blooded murder. Your age and alleged reluctance are of little mitigation." The trial served its political purpose. It provided a legal and public validation of the state's actions. It demonstrated that British justice could be both fair and severe, but it also left unresolved questions. Had justice been done for a frightened young man caught up in something bigger than himself? Or was he a legitimate terrorist receiving his due? The trial provided a verdict, but not a consensus. For the hostages, the trial was a necessary but painful closure. Seeing Faisal sentenced brought a measure of justice, but it also forced them to cycle through the trauma once more. For the SAS, it was an unwelcome exposure, a reminder that their secretive world could be dissected in public. And for the public, the trial was the final formal period at the end of the siege's sentence. The story had a convicted villain. The narrative arc was complete. But in a cell, a young man began serving a life sentence, a living, breathing remnant of the crisis that had once held a nation captive. The balaclava-clad figures abseiling down the embassy wall did more than rescue hostages. They shattered the SAS's code of secrecy. Overnight, the world's most clandestine special forces unit became global celebrities. For the regiment, this unprecedented exposure was a dangerous victory, forcing them to navigate a new world of fame, myth, and intensified scrutiny. Prior to May 5, 1980, the SAS was a shadowy rumor known only to military enthusiasts and the readers of adventure novels. Its existence was officially secret, its operations deniable. Prince's Gate changed everything. The assault was not just reported, it was televised. The image of the black-clad hoolie, SAS slang for a noisy, aggressive soldier, kicking in a window became an icon. The regiment was flooded with media requests, book deals, and overtures from Hollywood. The regiment's leadership, led by the shrewd Lieutenant Colonel Michael Rose, faced a dilemma. Total denial was impossible, but uncontrolled exposure was dangerous. It risked compromising future operations, endangering operatives and their families, and creating a star culture antithetical to the regiment's ethos of quiet professionalism. Rose's solution was a controlled, partial reveal. He authorized a carefully sanitized documentary, The Secret Regiment, which focused on training and history, not current operations. He allowed a handful of retired members to write memoirs, subject to strict vetting. The effect on recruitment was immediate and paradoxical. Applications soared. Every young man who saw the footage wanted to be the next abseiling hero. But the SAS didn't want glory seekers. They wanted the quiet, resilient, and intellectually agile. The selection process, always brutal, was emphasized even more to weed out those attracted by the myth rather than the reality. The regiment's public image became a useful filter and a potent recruiting sergeant, but it also created a management challenge. Operationally, the exposure was a net negative. Terrorist groups worldwide now had clear footage of SAS tactics, equipment, and methods. The crashing technique, the use of stun grenades, the abseil assaults, all were now in the public domain for study. Future adversaries would train to counter them. The SAS was forced to innovate constantly, to stay ahead of the copycats and the students of their own very public textbook. The freeze-frame image of a trooper abseiling, MP5 held ready, was as much a training aid for the IRA and other groups as it was a poster for patriotic Brits. The myth-making also created unrealistic public and political expectations. The success at Prince's Gate was seen as the standard. Any future hostage situation would be measured against it. Politicians and the public would now expect a similarly swift, decisive, and visually spectacular result, regardless of the tactical circumstances. This placed immense pressure on the SAS and the government in future crises, like the later Libyan Embassy siege, where the conditions were entirely different, and a Prince's Gate-style assault was impossible. Within the regiment, attitudes were mixed. Some older hands lamented the loss of secrecy. They saw the media attention as a corruption. The younger generation, who had executed the assault, were proud but wary. They enjoyed the private respect of their peers, but disliked the public spotlight. They knew their faces were now known to hostile intelligence services. Security for them and their families had to be tightened overnight. The civilian cost of their heroism was a lifetime of looking over their shoulders. The SAS's journey into the public eye was irreversible. They became a brand, synonymous with elite military prowess. But the regiment managed this transition with characteristic cunning. They used the fame as a weapon of deterrence, letting the world know the caliber of force they could bring to bear. They accepted the drawbacks as the price of a spectacular, necessary success. They remained, at their core, a secretive organization, but now they lived inside a globally recognized legend of their own making, a legend that began with a descent from a London rooftop into the blaze of television lights. The guns fell silent in Knightsbridge, but the diplomatic reverberations echoed for years. The siege had violated the sacred principle of diplomatic immunity, humiliated a revolutionary regime, and rewritten the rules of engagement between states and non-state actors. In the chanceries of the world, 16 Prince's Gate became a stark, new precedent. Iran's official reaction was one of fury and hypocrisy. The revolutionary government condemned the brutal attack on its diplomatic mission, a violation of the 1961 Vienna Convention. They expelled 2 British diplomats and threatened worse, but privately the regime was relieved. The embassy had been a nest of monarchist holdovers and anti-Khomeini elements. The siege, and its bloody end, allowed Tehran to paint the UK as a savage aggressor, while conveniently removing a problematic outpost. The relationship, already broken by the revolution, settled into a deep, formal freeze, where the siege became a foundational grievance. For other nations, the message was unambiguous. The UK would defend its sovereignty with extreme force, even within the traditionally inviolable space of an embassy. This had a chilling effect on terrorist groups considering similar actions in other Western capitals. It also put host nations on notice. If you cannot or will not control violent actors operating from your diplomatic premises, we may do it for you. This was a significant shift in the norms of international diplomacy. The siege accelerated the global development of dedicated counter-terrorism units. From France's GIGN to Germany's GSG-9, governments saw the need for a military-style capability that could operate in the gray zone between policing and war. The SAS's very public success provided a blueprint and a justification for funding these expensive elite forces. International training exchanges flourished, with the SAS becoming the de facto gold standard. The charred shell of the Iranian Embassy stood as a gruesome but effective advertisement for a new kind of warfare. However, the precedent also created dangers. It arguably lowered the threshold for military intervention in what had traditionally been police matters. Future governments might be tempted to go early with a military option, pressured by public memory of the SAS triumph, even when negotiation had a higher chance of success. The siege created an expectation of violent resolution that could bypass slower, more nuanced diplomatic or policing tools. The affair also highlighted the vulnerabilities of the diplomatic system itself. Embassies were soft targets. In the wake of Prince's Gate, security was dramatically upgraded at missions worldwide. Bulletproof glass, reinforced doors, armed guards and panic rooms became standard. The era of the open, accessible embassy was over. Diplomacy retreated behind higher walls and stricter protocols, a literal fortressing in response to the terrorist threat. For the UK Foreign Office, the siege was a protracted headache. For years, diplomats had to manage the fallout with Iran and other Arab states. They also had to navigate the new reality, where their colleagues overseas worked in virtual fortresses. The human dimension of diplomacy, the open house. The cultural exchange was eroded by security imperatives born on that street in London. Ultimately, the Iranian Embassy siege marked the moment when non-state terrorism forced a permanent change in the conduct of statecraft. It demonstrated that the old rules of diplomatic sanctuary could be exploited as a weapon, and that the response would be a new kind of sovereign violence, delivered with shocking speed and broadcast to the world. The civilian cost was not just the hostages' trauma, but a subtle degradation of the open international order, replaced by a more defensive, suspicious, and militarized paradigm for how nations interacted on each other's soil. The red pin dropped on London in 1980 left a permanent dent in the globe. 40 years on, the siege exists in two places: in the public memory as a crisp, heroic myth, and in the private memories of those who were there as a complex, painful truth. Its legacy is a ghost that haunts counter-terrorism policy, shapes special forces doctrine, and lingers in the quiet struggles of survivors who never truly left 16 Prince's Gate. The public legacy is set in stone, a textbook victory. It is taught in military academies as Operation Nimrod, a case study in decisive action. It is referenced in political speeches as an example of resolve. The imagery is recycled in video games and action movies. The black-clad figure abseiling down a building, now a universal shorthand for elite intervention. For the public, it is a satisfying story with a clear ending, but the professional legacy within the security services is more nuanced. The SAS learned that media management is now part of the operation. The success of Prince's Gate was as much about the powerful narrative it created as the bullets fired. Future operations would have to consider the optical dimension from the start. The regiment also internalized the lessons of the debrief. The need for better intelligence integration, more flexible entry options, and dedicated post-assault trauma support for both operatives and victims, a lesson slowly and incompletely learned. For police negotiators, the siege was a landmark that affirmed the value of patience and dialogue, even as it was overshadowed by the assault. The 6 days of negotiation wore the gunmen down, isolated Faisal, and provided the intelligence that made the assault possible. Modern hostage negotiation protocols worldwide still study the transcripts between Max Vernon and Salim, analyzing the psychology of stretching time and building fragile rapport under threat of death. The siege's darker legacy is the Nimrod expectation. It created a public and political appetite for the dramatic military-style finale. This has complicated countless subsequent sieges and kidnappings, where a Prince's Gate-style solution was neither possible nor desirable. Security forces now often fight the ghost of their own past success, managing expectations while trying to achieve less cinematic, but more sustainable, outcomes. For the survivors, the legacy is a lifetime. Some, like Sim Harris, rebuilt their lives and careers, though forever marked. Others, like Chris Kramer, found their paths irrevocably altered. Many have passed away, their obituaries forever defining them by those 6 days in 1980. They formed a loose, informal association of mutual understanding, but there was never a formal support group funded by the state that used their ordeal. Their legacy is a quiet testimony to the long-term human cost of terrorism and counter-terrorism, a cost rarely factored into the political calculus in the moment of crisis. The building itself, 16 Prince's Gate, was repaired and remains an embassy, now for the Dominican Republic. There is no plaque, no official memorial. The physical scars were plastered over. The event is commemorated not at the site, but in the SAS Regiment's Museum in Hereford, where a section of the burned balcony railing is displayed behind glass, a relic of the regiment's triumph, not a memorial to the civilians caught inside. The final, annotated assault plan from the SAS debrief, now declassified in part, sits in the National Archives. Researchers can request it. It is a dry, technical document. It does not capture the smell of smoke, the sound of a grenade pin being pulled, or the feel of a dead man's grip on a live bomb. It is the legacy of the mind. The legacy of the heart and the nerve endings resides elsewhere, in the private silences of aging men and women who, when the rain falls a certain way, or a curtain billows in a draft, are momentarily transported back to a room they never truly escaped. The last echoes of stun grenades faded. The television cameras lingered on the smoking embassy doorway. In the public's mind, Operation Nimrod was a flawless, heroic victory. But for those who stormed the building, and for those pulled from it, the story was just beginning to fracture into 1,000 private truths, where the price of a nation's resolve would be measured in silent trauma and political aftershocks. The morning after the assault, 16 Prince's Gate stood as a violated shell. Police forensic teams moved through the carnage in the slow, deliberate dance of evidence collection. 5 gunmen were dead. 1, Faisal, had been taken alive, hiding among the hostages, the frightened young man the listeners had identified. 19 hostages had emerged alive. The 2 casualties were hostage Abbas Lavasani, the embassy's press officer, killed by the terrorists before the assault began, and hostage Ali Akbar Samadzadeh, caught in the crossfire during the rescue. PC Trevor, who had wrestled Salim to the ground as the SAS burst in, was now a public hero, though he would forever reject the label, haunted by the intimacy of violence. The political and diplomatic fallout was immediate and complex. The British government, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, was unequivocally triumphant. A sovereign attack on UK soil had been met with decisive lethal force. The Falklands factor of national resolve, often attributed to the war 2 years later, was born in the smoke of Prince's Gate. Internationally, reactions split along Cold War lines. The US and allies praised the operation. Iran, after initial fury, quietly accepted the outcome. The removed regime loyalists within the embassy were an embarrassment to the new revolutionary government. The siege had, paradoxically, clarified a fraught diplomatic relationship. For the SAS, Operation Nimrod was a double-edged sword. Their unprecedented televised success blew their cherished secrecy apart. They became instant legends, their balaclavas and black gear an icon of elite military prowess. But within the regiment, there was discomfort. The operation, while successful, had been messy and perilously close to disaster. The crashing method through windows was born of compromised intelligence about barricades. The public glare threatened future operations. They returned to Hereford, analyzing every second of the 17-minute assault, perfecting the tactics that would define counter-terrorism for a generation. But they now lived in a new world of public celebrity. The civilian cost, however, etched itself in less public ways. The surviving hostages were thrust into a media maelstrom, then largely abandoned to cope with profound psychological trauma. Chris Kramer, later a senior BBC executive, and others suffered from PTSD for decades, their lives permanently shadowed by those 6 days. The families of the 2 slain hostages received no formal state compensation, their loss a private sorrow against a backdrop of public jubilation. P.C. Locke, awarded the George Medal, struggled with the weight of his enforced heroism and the visceral memory of the fight for Salim's gun. The siege also set dangerous precedents. It demonstrated the power of terrorist media strategy. The gunmen had meticulously used the press to broadcast their demands, and it showed states that a spectacular, violent resolution could yield a massive boost in political capital. The template for the modern hostage crisis media circus, protracted negotiation, and potential for bloody resolution was now set. The wall map in the SAS briefing room gained its final bloody pin, but similar maps in counter-terror units across the globe were just being started. In the end, the Iranian Embassy siege was not an ending, but a violent genesis. It marked the moment when counter-terrorism warfare moved from the shadows of covert ops into the living room light of public spectacle. It forged the modern SAS myth, hardened Thatcher's Britain, and left a group of ordinary civilians and a lone policeman to carry the hidden human weight of a nation's show of strength. The dust settled on Prince's Gate, but the echoes of those gunshots still resonate wherever politics, media, and violence intersect. This story was built from thousands of pages of public testimony, inquest reports, and the brave accounts of survivors. But history is a puzzle with missing pieces. Did political pressure force the SAS hand? What happened in the closed-door debriefs that forever changed hostage policy? The search for truth never ends. We need your help. If you have any information, documents, or personal connections to the events of 1980 that have remained private, you can contribute anonymously to this ongoing investigation. Visit our secure portal or contact our research team. Help us complete the map. For 6 days in 1980, the world held its breath. We witnessed the terrifying blurring of war and diplomacy, of news and nightmare. Operation Nimrod was more than a rescue. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the rubble of a London embassy. It taught us that in the face of terror, democracies could respond with breathtaking violence. It also taught us that the cost of that response is borne quietly, in the nightmares of survivors and the solemn duty of soldiers who must become executioners. As the red pin was pressed into the map on that final day, it marked not just a location, but a turning point. The age of modern terror, and of its shadowy, mirrored response, had been inaugurated, live on television. The siege is over. The reckoning continues.